many different things, as you said. The project with the Citizen Lab goes back to my past life, working in the human rights sector, working on gender and digital security. So this is a consultancy with the lab to develop a sort of strategic research agenda on what are the gaps in understanding gender and digital security, primarily looking at online abuse faced by human rights defenders, journalists, and what could a place like the Citizen Lab do? And the lab's work, I mean, you know what the lab does, so maybe if you need to give some context.
No, I think actually we just leave it at that. And those things are some of the things that just prove my point that when you meet Maya at a party, you want to know more about the stuff that she's doing. And you totally can, because we're having drinks afterwards. But the reason why you're here today is connected to something you did quite recently at Transmediale. So you were part of a study circle there that was working on the idea of affective infrastructure. And actually a few of us were at your talk at Transmediale, and we were kind of thrilled to see what you're doing there. And that's why, one reason why we wanted to invite you and dive a little deeper into what you did there. And this is exactly what your talk now is going to be about. And I will sit a little bit over there and come back to stage to talk more about this with you. But now the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you again for giving me the space. I think this is, yeah, it's on, but maybe it just needs to be a little bit closer. Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah? I mean, also for the live stream, most importantly. Thank you. So it is actually very humbling to have an invitation to be able to think about difficult ideas out loud with people, and especially on such a beautiful day when you could be outdoors. So this talk will have 3 parts to it, and I hope to lead you through it gently and smoothly. There is some theory in it. Some of it is complex. It's also new for me. This is an idea I've been engaging with for the last 6 months. And there's one particular article that talks about affective infrastructures a lot. I've been reading it for 6 months, and it's still tough. But just think of it as, you know, when theory comes up and it's difficult, it's challenging. Imagine being in the back of the plane and there's turbulence. What you have to do is you just hold the armrest and just breathe, and it will be fine. That's how you deal with theory. So in the beginning was data, but it was small. The personal story, the case study, the story told through sobs after the 3rd drink, or not at all. You taught me my first workplace lesson. I was 23, you were 43. I grew up reading your smart opinions and dreamt of being as erudite as you. You were one of my professional heroes. Turns out you were as talented a predator as you were a writer. It was more date, less interview. I escaped that night, and you hired me. I worked for you for many months, even though I swore I would never be in a room alone with you again. Women who work at Microsoft on the Xbox team say that they've been called bitch at least once in their work lives. Another refused to sleep with a colleague and was threatened with death. Yet another was asked to sit on a colleague's lap at a meeting with HR and executives present, and no one said anything. So about 18 months ago, these small data became a hashtag. The data became a flood, and the details didn't matter. You just had to say 2 words. The data had volume, velocity, and variety, so then we could call it big data. But like big data, it was not raw, but it was made of things that felt raw. But data is always cooked. It always comes from someone making choices about what to put in and what to keep out. So it is no surprise that the most popular and dominant forms for organizing information today, the spreadsheet, the data sheet, the data set, the hashtag, have converted what was always my story and your story into a data story. The body had to become data so that it could be seen. So we had the shitty men in media list, the shitty men in the arts list, the list of sexual harassers in academia, the Hollywood list, the Bollywood list. But let me just talk about one list, because all data are different and have their own histories. So in 2017, 2 Dalit feminist students of Indian origin, Raya and Inji, both in California, put up a spreadsheet called LOSHA, List of Sexual Harassers in Academia, LOSHA. This included the names of 50-odd Indian men academics living in India, Europe, the UK, and the US, and included some very illustrious names. Before our eyes, the spreadsheet expanded to more than 70 names. Disclosure, I have a friend whose name is on the list, also an acquaintance who lives here in Berlin. The list had just a few columns: who, what, where, when. Data, which offers all kinds of analytical possibilities, was instead now being referred to as empty, desperate, chaotic, and anarchic. It made no sense to just put up a list online. But the thing is, people have always been making accusations, and for a long time, like we have the Whisper network. It is really great infrastructure, but it is mostly invisible, and that's its point, that's why it works. But somehow, it was not enough anymore to just talk among ourselves. Something is significantly broken. So the first thing that happened in response to the Losha list was that a group of senior Indian feminist academics wrote an open letter in defense of one person on that list, one of their friends. The old feminists were suspicious of social media, of accusations that could be made on Google spreadsheets without quote-unquote due process. It is important to note that most of these older academics have been closely involved in social justice movements and activism on rape, sexual harassment, dowry deaths, honor killings, and so on. Some of them have been dear mentors and inspirations. The younger women responded, "You oldies are obsolete. Your stupid blog is obsolete. Your networks are obsolete." The young women responded that they had taken to social media and the internet because nothing else had made good on its promise of due process. So the immediate outcome of the list of sexual harassers in academia was a conflict about whose feminism was purer. This is not unlike the moment 3 years ago when a group of people set up a website called jacobapplebaum.net detailing Applebaum's sexually abusive behavior and sexual bullying. The first thing that happened was that a group of 6 women wrote a response quite similar to the one that the Indian feminist academics did. The website, ourresponse.org, is now not available online, and it has anime characters dancing across it instead. But what I really want to get to here is not just the accusations themselves, but what happens the day after the revolution, when the Maidan or the square has to be cleared of torn posters and old coffee cups. It is not actually as simple as making allegations online. People who make allegations of sexual abuse know this already. Women are having to quit jobs and find new ones to organize evidence in cases. When cases do go to court, they're having to go through internal complaints committees or having to withstand online and offline attacks for making allegations. They have to find emotional resilience to go through the aftermath of putting your story out there. So women are sharing information and preparing and supporting each other, encouraging each other in WhatsApp groups, email lists, and offline. This is the work of care and support that comes after. But the other big shift that's taking place is this flowering of uncertainty and unhappiness, this discomfort about how broken our sociality is. So consider this. The actor Henry Cavill says in an interview to Australian GQ, quote, "It's very difficult to do that if there are certain rules in place. I don't want to go up and talk to her because I'm going to be called a rapist or something. So you're like, forget it. I'm going to call an ex-girlfriend instead, and then just go back to a relationship which never really worked. But it's way safer than casting myself into the fires of hell because I'm someone in the public eye, and if I go and flirt with someone, then who knows what's going to happen." So we're having to deal with hesitation, awkwardness, self-consciousness, nervousness, uncertainty, and fear about our relationships. This emotional management calls for a coordination of mind and feeling, watchfulness and awareness of your body, and a renegotiation of social scripts, a struggle to find the right words. How might these difficult, uncertain, and awkward aspects of intimacy become new territories for thinking about emotional management that we have to do in new ways of relating? Now, I don't want to valorize some kind of older form of, things were better in the past, it was a kinder, gentler time, and that things are just complicated now. I don't think so. I don't think it was ever better in the past. I think there was just a time when women were either silent or they muttered to each other under their breaths. So in moments of uncertainty, we rush to establish things that reassure us. So consider the rise of sexual consent apps like Good to Go and Sassy, or my favorite, Legal Fling, that puts consent on the blockchain. So I quote from their website, "Communication and understanding is key. Talking about rules and boundaries before sex can be awkward and uncomfortable for some. Having an app that clearly shows the rules of engagement, as well as personal preferences, can remove misunderstandings and prevent unintentional bad situations, end quote. Or you have Netflix that passes the 5-second rule in their company, saying that employees cannot make eye contact for longer than 5 minutes or stay in a lingering hug. So I want to consider Me Too and its aftermath as a kind of affective infrastructure. And this is the part where I start to draw on Laurent Berlant's concept of the same name. But before that, first, we have to really dismantle our idea of what infrastructure is, and that it is material. That infrastructure is roads and water systems, nuclear power plants, airlines, museums. Brian Larkin, Susan Lee Starr, and others remind us that infrastructure is as much things as the relationship between things. It is values and symbols, beliefs that sustain organizations. It is a multiplicity of cultural factors. But even things like roads and highways are all about cultural values of freedom and autonomy and individuality. So it's interesting to study the cultural history of US highway infrastructure, which I've been doing a lot of in the last few years because I study autonomous vehicles. So you kind of understand that engineering, highway engineering in the Cold War is a really interesting rabbit hole that's very much bound up in ideas of freedom and individuality. Infrastructure is people, says Abdul Malik Simone. It is not just things. If you look at how roads are built in India, it often starts with a thin man in a thin cotton shirt hacking at a hot tar road with a spade under the blazing sun. So let us be wary of materiality as infrastructure and infrastructure as materiality. Let us be wary of the metaphors that come to mind, networks and grids primarily. We are so deep in network thinking that it is difficult to consider an ontology without networks. Just because a space on a grid is shared intends nothing about the affective and material substance or even the fact of membership. Laurent Berlant invites us to try. So affective infrastructure pushes up against the idea that infrastructure is physical and material. I like to think of affective infrastructure as more like synaptic relationships, in which neurotransmitters convey messages across gaps between neurons through osmosis, rather than how muscles are attached to bones by tendons. But affect itself is cognitive, it is proprioceptive, behavioral, and psychological. So everything from our facial expressions, respiration, tone of voice, posture, they all transmit affect. We are not self-contained in terms of our energies, says Berlant. Because affect is unformed and unstructured, it can also be transmitted between bodies. So a starting point for thinking about affective infrastructure are things that are ephemeral and unstructured, things that are more in the air. So what does it mean to be connected to others, not only by emotions that are shaped and shared by language, but desires that are visceral, that may be pre-linguistic and bodily, and affect that overlaps these? So I'm not saying that just because we have shared emotions, this is an affective infrastructure. Life would be really simple if that was the case, but I don't think it is. Quote, again Berlant, quote, "Suddenly we dilute what we call structural by shifting the force of the normative infrastructures from the state and commodity capitalism into the ordinary, that also includes local plural intimacies and associations that make life sticky and interesting for it. But this multiplication of forms in movement is not a denial of colonial, racial, patriarchal class inheritance." The other significant aspect of affective infrastructures is the idea of movement rather than something fixed and established. And when we think of infrastructures, because of its materiality, we think of this sort of fixed thing. Movement is what distinguishes infrastructures from institutions. And I think institutions have this way of sort of like congealing power and interest, and there's a sort of predictability on which the social institutional relies. Institutions norm reciprocity, but I think what affective infrastructures talk about are these more ephemeral sort of patterns, habits, norms, or scenes of assemblage that are a little bit more dynamic. So they trouble this tightness of sociality and sort of like show us how things are broken. And it is an infrastructure of that which is destabilizing and shifting. But yet, there is still something that holds us together. So things like going back to the list, the challenges and approaches to feminism itself, and how to deal with these generational divides that I was referring to between the older and younger feminists, the impact of Me Too, or our different thoughts on what Aziz Ansari did, or the disagreements about what Joe Biden did, smelling people's hair or putting his hands on people's shoulders. It would be easy if all violations were about rape or non-consensual masturbating in front of a date or a colleague, but it is not. There are cases where we do not agree, we do not understand that we do not see these things on the same level, on the same plane. Even as women, we may look at another generation or at another woman's discomfort and feel frustrated and we disagree. And I think that this is kind of where, for me, this is where I start thinking about what the affective infrastructure idea or concept really is. It is what binds us as we move. They are not pre-existing, they're not material, and the connection lies in our uncertainty. So when we resist that which is difficult or awkward, I would like to think that this is possibly when we are actually moving towards each other. And these are the words that actually Berlant uses in her article on affective infrastructures. Actually, the article is called The Commons, Infrastructures for Troubling Times. And just given the scope of this talk and what I wanted to do here, I didn't go into the commons in a big way. I'm not going to. But I like to keep coming back to these words because this is about that more sort of difficult space of trying to sort of connect with each other. So I'm going to shift and move from sort of Berlant and Me Too and affective infrastructures, but to talk about affect itself, because affect is becoming really important in terms of the next big thing in AI. And very soon, I gather that all the kinds of affect we've been talking about, these uncertainties and awkwardnesses, these exhaustions, they will appear as glitches and bugs or be classified as not affect. So I think that what we're seeing is a structuring of affect to mean something very specific, and that's what I'd like to talk about. So affective computing is of a couple of different kinds, and there are some interesting new examples. So consider, for example, Wobot, a therapy bot in an app that helps track your mood and talk you through the reality of living with depression. Or there is Lovot, powered by love, a silly, adorable little robot that just wants to make you happy. Then there is Paro, a soft, cuddly baby harp seal that does not move and makes soft animal noises. It is used in therapy with autistic children and older people in homes, including those with dementia. Paro does not make the first move, and it remembers how it was held, and it does not feel bad if it was rejected or ignored. Then there is the other kind of affective computing, how our faces, voices, and body language are mined to feed the growing industry of emotion AI. Emotional artificial intelligence is, quote, the process of giving machines the ability to recognize and react to human emotion, end quote. So Affektiva is an important company in this field because it was incubated at MIT and is kind of one of the front runners, an early pioneer. And they're developing data sets of human affect and emotion to train future bots and digital interfaces to, quote, understand all things human, as their tagline goes. At its foundation, affective computing is about breaking down human facial expressions into a map of emotional states. Here is what Affektiva says about how it works. Humans use a lot of nonverbal cues, humans use a lot of nonverbal cues such as facial expressions, gesture, body language, tone of voice to communicate their emotions. Our vision is to develop emotion AI that can detect emotions just the way humans do. Our emotion AI unobtrusively measures unfiltered and unbiased facial expressions of emotion using any optical sensor or just a standard webcam. Our computer vision algorithms identify key landmarks on the face, for example, the corners of your eyebrows, the tip of your nose, the corners of your mouth. Deep learning algorithms then analyze pixels in those regions to classify facial expressions. Combinations of these facial expressions are then mapped onto emotions. So Affektiva is selling this technology to the automotive industry to understand drivers' and passengers' states and moods, to address critical safety concerns like road rage and driver fatigue. So a future car might issue a calming and authoritative order to an angry driver to pull over. Or the car might increase the air conditioning to make a sleepy driver more uncomfortable and therefore alert. Our faces and voices betray a lot about us, like if we're lying or angry. And in the UK, 1 in 5 people lies to insurers or attempts to defraud them. So affective computing is being used to identify possible lying and cheating through facial features and voice. But affective computing is also for humans to have a better experience relating to humanoid bots, digital assistants, and chatbots. Bots and digital assistants are perceived to be awkward to interact with because they lack affect. So when Google launched Duplex, its voice-based digital assistant, they emphasized how natural sounding it was. quote, the system also sounds more natural thanks to the incorporation of speech disfluencies, for example, hms and ers. And one of the reasons why I'm reading out from this script today and not actually just talking, because I make a lot of ms and hers. So adding synthetic weights, which allows the system to signal in a natural way that it is still processing. This is what people often do when they are gathering their thoughts. In user studies, we found that conversations using these disfluencies sound more familiar and natural, end quote. In this, the not humanness of the voice assistant is trained out by real-time supervision of the software by a human. The system then learns how to negotiate around that mistake the next time. Making a bot sound more human in this way is to reduce friction, that is, to not alert the human on the other end that they are talking to a bot, or to suspend disbelief for longer that we are talking to a human. So we can quickly see how these systems of capture will create a map. This is what happiness looks like, or this is what surprise looks like, or this is what it looks like when somebody puts their hands on your shoulders. But the thing with affect is that affect is also awkward, unique, and personal, bodily and physical. It may be difficult to analyze and process. I mean, as humans, we have problems recognizing and understanding what people are saying. But with the capture of enough human emotional data, we could possibly establish some clarity about what things mean. So, and this is actually an image from some new research that I think is quite interesting and difficult because it eventually comes back to social control. So it's about sort of evaluating human poses and gaits to understand if people are being threatening or violent in some way. And I want to close by acknowledging that there are two very different kinds of things, different kinds of moves that I've been talking about here that we need to struggle with in trying to theorize together. I actually wanted to end like, one of my favorite movies is Reality Bites, which tells you how old I am. And the Winona Ryder character is the valedictorian of a high school class, and she's, making this really important speech. And at the end of it, she's like, the answer is, and she says, I don't know. And the crowd goes crazy and everybody loves her. I'm kind of feeling a little bit like that as well, because this is what Berlant urges us to acknowledge, that sociality is difficult, it is broken, and it is unbearable. And socially necessary proximity is hard. We are constantly dealing with the pain and privilege of others. It's difficult. But we're also simultaneously seeing a growth in the industry of the capture of emotions and affect in an attempt to make human feeling legible, to control people and manage our errors and deviance. And through acts of prediction as well, capturing and analyzing our emotional data to predict what we might do or establish paths of expected behavior based on patterns emerging from prior situations. And that is the conundrum that I'm going to leave you with now and that I hope we can talk about more. Thanks. Oh, right.
We will sit down again in these wonderful comfy chairs. Thank you so much for the talk and also for bringing this very nice presentation. I still feel that it's not so easy to wrap your head around this idea of affective infrastructure. So maybe we start there and try to unpack this idea a little bit more to make it easier to understand. So how would you start explaining like what this idea is about? You said in your talk it's like going away from the idea that infrastructure is something material. So what else is it then?
So it's all of these other things. But you know what? I'm going to try and I'm kind of going to disrupt your process a little bit. And I would just actually like to ask people, because I've been talking for like 25 minutes. And can I just ask if anyone has a question or a clarification or a thought about, if it's not something material, and if it is about our affect, then what does that say to you? I mean, this is a really hard concept, but what might it mean?
That's a very good experiment to see if, if it was easy to understand.
I mean, it's not. If you haven't actually read what Berlant means, but extrapolating from there, it's still possible to think about what it could mean for affect and emotions to be infrastructure.
Anyone? I can hand you a mic. Yes? Katrin?
So let's see if I can collect my thoughts. I found the distinction between infrastructure and institutions quite helpful, because when I think of infrastructure, as I think of movement and flow and relations between people. And with regards to affect, I'm wondering if infrastructure isn't typically something that does that more or less neutralizes affect. When I think of infrastructure, for example, a water faucet or electricity or even Wi-Fi at home, it's unless it's broken and the process is disrupted, I'm not really see myself as affected by it. And that is, for me, a key feature of infrastructure with regards to affect, actually.
Okay. Anyone else have any thoughts?
Yeah, I had the whole time I had this question: what this infrastructure, is it a trust? Because I didn't find any I find many description about trust or non-trust, but the whole concept of trust or trust as part of the effect that we want to reach or not reach, or that is actually the emotion that we try to deal. That was my thought or question that I thought on it. Because doesn't it all bring it to that question of the emotional concept of trust, of affective structure? Because that's what we want between machine and human to create in order to interact, if I understood it right. If I look at the Me Too movement, we have mistrust. And we're not so sure. And if we trust, we are sure, and then we can make a good judgment about the affective infrastructure as well.
Trust ourselves or trust other people?
Yeah, both, and the affective infrastructure, if I work with an app or an IA or something like that.
Did you want to say something else?
I'm still collecting my mind, so it might take a while.
No, that's fine. I just thought I saw you. I thought I read some affect. Questioning affect.
Pretty much leading into my points.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I had the idea. I was wondering if you know this a new term that goes around right now about stochastic terrorism. Did you heard about it?
No, but you're gonna
the
tell
idea
us.
is basically, the Christchurch terrorist. He was kind of. The right is kind of creating this environment and the sentiment with a lot of abuse and violence and vocal violence against minorities, and this kind of raises the probability of some people to commit like these attacks. But it's not like that you can really, measure the effect on a particular individual, but, it's like it raises the probability. So maybe my question would be, do you consider this, this sentiment or this general sentiment or this rhetoric or this whole surrounding that the rights is creating as an effective infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I wanted to put that into the talk. Sometimes it's easier for us to think about the negative or the gross as to get into these concepts. But I think, so here's my thing on affective infrastructures. This is the Winona Ryder moment. I don't know. In that, when I say I don't know, I mean that I think it is more a starting point for us to consider something. The whole point is to say it is not this material thing like the waterworks and the pipes and the sewage system. And maybe there's a lot of things being in the air in her article, and where people kind of influenced by these ideas talk about things in the air and things that are ephemeral and unstructured. So to talk about kind of terrorism and violence, another really interesting example is to think about borders that exist, or the regulation of borders that exist in the air. So the study of tear gas is really interesting in how it goes from like labs to World War I to now being used against protesters, okay? And in fact, when the study circle at Transmediale, where we were working on these ideas, one of the people who was part of the circle started talking. This was the day when there was a very famous photograph circulating online of a young woman and her child who were tear gassed, I think on the border between the US and Mexico. And so she said, the question was, what is in the air? What makes for our convergence through things in the air? And she said, what is in the air is tear gas. And the history of tear gas is interesting because it sets up borders that we cannot see, and it sets up boundaries that exist in the air. We never think of the air as a space that can be colonized in different ways and that has borders. We think of borders as things that are on land, but the air is a heavily policed space. There's even a term for it that academics use, atmospheric governance. It's everything from, if you think about spectrum, to airways, to how planes move, to things like tear gas, or things that are literally in the air and are still sort of, nobody's touching you at all, but they are making you cry, right? I mean, it's like, whether it's like algorithmically curated tears that seem to come to you through, things that you're given to watch online, algorithmically curated tears from the images that you see, or tear gas. It's thinking about the ephemeral in this way may be the sort of starting point to think about what affective infrastructures are. And I agree, it's a terribly confusing, difficult phrase. But I like it because it's like it pushes you to say, oh, there's something else going on that we have to acknowledge between the things that hold us together and that keep us apart.
Maybe we come back to the example that you gave for affective infrastructure yourself in the talk, talking about Me Too. And in your talk, you talked about these lists that appeared of women who pointed to predators that they met in their life. And I wondered about this point of infrastructure for us very often being something invisible. And Me Too created an infrastructure by making something visible. Could you speak a little bit more about this? Like, how has this new infrastructure changed and opened up something that didn't exist before?
I don't know. I think I always tend to think about invisibility and visibility in the same. They're the same thing, actually, or that it's something that those two have to always be sort of unpacked together or negotiated at the same time together. It's very difficult to have one without the other sometimes, or you have to constantly negotiate between the two, depending on who you are. I think if you have a lot of power and privilege in a situation, then you're open, you have nothing to hide, you can control everything about yourself. But if you're somebody who always has something about yourself that you're uncertain about, I think then you want to be able to control your visibility much more. In terms of Me Too, I think, so there's the obvious stuff like, oh, social media became infrastructure for people to do activism, which they have been doing for a long time. But I think what happened in that conversation is, or what happens in that conversation is, there's a lot of emphasis on social media itself, as it has been with other kinds of revolutions and moments where we say, oh, this is the infrastructure. But actually, the infrastructure comes from supporting people who you have never met, or doing the work of online activism in ways that are unpaid or unrecognized, because this is not just about going out and shouting that, to bring down a dictator. It's not the same kind of thing. You're actually in an environment where you're making claims and allegations, you're putting yourself out there. So I think the affective infrastructure sort of idea there is more about how people come together, how they believe each other or they don't believe each other, how they sort of, the work that they have to do in private spaces that are sometimes digital, sometimes not, or the difficult conversations that have to happen, like code, and we were talking about this. We have codes of conduct that people are talking about now, which are absolutely important, which have always been there, but this is a moment to bring them out. Yeah.
There's a question, okay.
I think because it's
Okay. I wonder if you would feel as though these affective infrastructures and what are often considered material infrastructures, if they're different in kind or different in degree, because there seems to be, especially with what we're talking about right now in relationship to Me Too, there seems to be an affective economy of ideas and thoughts and emotions and affects that are circulating, but what these infrastructures are attempting to do is to codify certain behaviors, right? So they concretize them in some sort of infrastructure that then goes from this immaterial affective realm into something that is structurable. And I don't know, it seems that arguably you could make this statement about a lot of, especially political change, right? That it starts from ideas and then you can concretize it into something. I wondered if that reflects what you were speaking about at all.
I think you said it really well, Nick. Thank you. I'm totally going to use that. No, I like that. It makes a lot of sense. And I think we go between those things all the time, right? Even thinking about the example of right-wing movements. And I mean, this is a whole other interesting area to think about how political ideas and values are circulated on the basis of negative emotions and negative affect. I mean, I think it's absolutely, and we have seen also recently the formation of actual codification of political values or beliefs, but through the circulation and amplification of these, negative ideas. I don't know if that answers your question, though.
I think we're getting closer to understanding it.
It's there. We'll
one
get
thing
there.
that popped up for me was, what is exactly the difference between affect and emotion? Because I think one is definitely linked to the other. And in your talk you said, I noted it, that affect is unformed. But when I look at the pictures of the faces that you had, it appeared to me that exactly affect is the opposite. It's very clearly formed for us. We recognize it right away. If somebody is scared, we recognize it right away. And it has, a very specific form. For me, it's more the emotion part that is less of a form and harder to recognize sometimes. So where would you draw the line, and where's the difference of these two things?
So that's interesting, because actually I think the definition is flipped. It's the other way. So this, you mean this picture? This one?
Yes.
Okay. So this is actually a really famous image. Well, this is one of many based on the work of a psychologist called Paul Ekman from 1978, where he came up with the set of 6 dominant emotions, and the 7th is just neutral. So you have happiness, sadness, surprise, anger, fear, disgust. I think these are the main emotions. And the other one, this one, sort of expands it out. So the thing about emotion is that actually emotion is the thing which is formed by language. Emotions are shared, we have words for them, and we describe them in language. And feelings are usually entirely personal and biographical. They become emotions when we share them with people, and we're able to express them through language. And affect is that slightly awkward place in the middle, which sort of overlaps the two, because it is about facial expressions and features, but it is also, proprioception is a really interesting idea and word, because it's about it's things like your motor coordination, your posture, your stance. You can have absolutely no verbal language. You may not be saying anything at all, but you can tell how somebody is feeling based on how they're standing or what their posture is or the shallowness or depth of their breath. I remember the difference in this way. I read somewhere, and I have the reference actually on the last slide. Babies have feelings, but they don't have emotions. And parents get very upset when you tell them that, because you're bringing this. They're like, no, of course my daughter has emotions. No, she does. She definitely does. But she is an infant. So infants usually don't have verbal language, but they definitely have feelings, and they have affect, and they have ways of addressing it. But emotion is also shared and social. That's the other thing. So you reading those faces is about emotion, because you have certain linguistic concepts already to make sense of those things. But I think that it becomes, well, actually, I'll stop there, if that distinction is clear.
It's definitely clearer for me, it's getting clearer for me. But I want to draw in something else that you've been working on a lot, and it was one of those moments where Maya had a very strong thesis. I think it was almost 2 years ago, and I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I want to learn more about that. And that was your thesis that even then you said that AI is going to be huge in the care sector and in emotional connection to humans. And so you started talking about this a little bit, but why were you so convinced that this would happen even 2 years ago? Why was it so clear for you, and where do you see this development going now?
Oh, I think there were already lots of apps and things that were coming out at that time. So my favorite one is this one that we used actually in when I was in Tactical Tech, and we did this project called the Glass Room, this exhibition. So there was one called Silver Mother, and it's an app which is basically, it's a webcam. It's in your old mother. It's always the mother, you know, your mother's maiden name. It's never your father or your uncle. Anyway, so your old mother is in the house on her own, and she can't take care of herself. So there's a webcam, which is, you know, obviously looking at her, and the app, and I think there may be motion sensors as well. It allows you to just kind of basically surveil your mother. In a gentle sort of way, to make sure that she's remembered to take her medication, that she's eaten, that she hasn't fallen. So that, I remember, really pushed a lot of buttons for me, for a lot of other people, because the fact is, yes, you do want to take care of your parents, you do want to make sure that they're okay, but you also maybe don't want them to live in your house, or you can't support them, so they have to be somewhere else, you know? And then you have this kind of odd surveillance at a distance. And I think it's, so yes, there is a literal care function, but I think it's also sort of exactly how it is to care for other people, because it is complicated and it's hard. And the way you want to care for someone is not how they want to be cared for. You know, so I think that app was important in making me think about it, but there must have been a couple of other things like that. Yeah, just kind of in the field, but yeah.
Okay, I will have one last connecting question, and then I would give the mic to more questions in the room, and I think people from the network had brought some more questions as well. So the follow-up question for me here would be, don't you think that the way you described how AI is being developed to be an emotional response to humans, isn't this still staying like very on the surface of things? Like, where is this going to take us in understanding emotions when the technologies that we're interacting with are good at reading the effects, but they will never understand the feelings that, where the way you explained it, are on a very different level?
Yeah, so I kind of think it doesn't matter whether the machine understands your feeling, but you have the feeling that you're being understood is more sort of important sometimes. So there's this app called Wobot. I find it really interesting. It's the app which helps you track your mood and helps you deal with depression, and I think certain kinds of depression. And a friend of mine was, you know, I asked them to start working on it to sort of understand what it was like, and actually it's based on, like, you know, solid research. Stanford University psychologists, you know, that counts for something, and the tone is very conversational. I think I could see that the UX and the sort of design was quite clever, and they didn't use it over a period of time, though, and I was quite annoyed because I was like, please, this is for research purposes, you know, please use the app. But I think with time you can, and I've read about this particular app, you get the feeling that something is supporting you through your day, helping you make sense of your emotions, reminding you to do things. A lot of dealing with emotions is also about something or someone orienting you and giving you sort of structure. So I have this little Twitter care bot which I follow and which follows me. It's just called Tiny Care Bot. It says things like, please remember to look up from your screen, or wiggle your toes, or listen to some music that you like. And you know, the weird thing is, every time the stupid thing pops up, I'm like, oh yeah, I should actually like wiggle my toes. It's nice when someone does that, or, you know, reminds you to do those things for you. So there's that level of stuff, which, because I don't know about depth and shallowness. I don't know if I want to use that, but I think that the stuff about pose recognition, gait recognition, and when these things become part of social control mechanisms, yeah, I mean, we can see where this is going. There's that element of it, but that element of surveillance and control, facial recognition, all of that, for me, that is not as kind of awkward or sinister when we get into kind of deep emotional relationships with interfaces. And I think there's only going to be more of it. I don't want to judge that, you know, beyond. I have a political judgment on it, but I think that it's very real for people. I think that it's extremely real for people, especially when you're kind of alone, when you are new in a place, when you're isolated for various reasons. I think that kind of care is, connection is real.
So how does the audience think about this? Yes, there's a question. Microphone is coming.
I'm still not entirely sure about the coherency of what I'm going to say, but I'm going to try. So one thing that popped up regularly, thinking about the whole idea of affect, especially categorizing affect, let's call it electronically or digitally, is that often the expression of emotions differs from the actual feeling inside. For example, like a very strong example would be teenagers laughing at a catastrophe, just because they cannot cope with the fact that hundreds of people have died. They would just sit in front of the TV and laugh. Right, a computer reading that laughter, would suddenly categorize you as sympathizing with the terrorist attack or something, right? And the same thing goes, for example, for autistic people, who, when having a meltdown, when shutting down, would express their facial expressions or any emotional expression would completely differ from a neurotypical person. So I don't really know I don't really have a question about this, but this is sort of a thought that popped in my mind regularly, and I'm so, to a certain degree, I'm frightened exactly about that aspect and any kind of policing or social thing that comes afterwards, like machines reading your emotions and then categorizing them the wrong way, and whatever effect that has. So that's just something I wanted to add.
No, that's completely the problem. I mean, already these systems are so kind of narrowly defined, narrowly tested and developed. I mean, even Paul Ekman's 6 emotions. I mean, that's great, but it's from 1978 and a very specific cultural context. And, that is the basis for all of the image recognition data sets, the facial emotional recognition data sets even now. I mean, they have some very unique specific ones. So, for example, there's the Japanese female facial emotion data set, which is very specific because there's a lot of research in Japan on these things. So, but that's again, when you expand that and try to extrapolate it and apply that same data set to build some other AI that's going to be used in another context, of course, this misrecognition, the glitches, and then the prediction based on what does it mean, or the analysis of the machine kind of deciding who you are based on that is, it's a cluster, whatever you call it, yeah.
But doesn't this actually raise a number of kind of stranger questions about the human processing of emotions and affect? Or actually, oftentimes there's no definitive correlation, especially moving across cultures and contexts, between what we feel, our feelings, and the emotional and affective registers that come out. And so it's funny, I mean, we get so fearful of machines interpreting these things, but actually humans are terrible at expressing them and interpreting them. So I wonder how that plays in the mix to kind of throw it back at us.
Totally, no, and which is why the whole, I mean, for me, that Me Too thing, what's most interesting is this sort of hesitation and is this awkwardness and and in the last 6 months, I've been in a few situations where men have really made an effort to step up and clarify things about how they're talking, how they're interacting, what they mean, and I'm always like, oh my God, thank you so much for doing that, but this is not abusive, this is not violative, you're not splaining me or anything, it's just a conversation, or we're just hanging out, and it's become very, very uncomfortable. It's almost like none of us know how to be anymore. Somebody was telling me how they, can't tell somebody that they look nice, and the thing is, this becomes like this anxiety moment, when it's like, oh, now we can't even say these things to each other. And I don't think that's actually what's going on. We've always been probably quite bad at expressing and reading. And now it's, now you know the camera is looking at you. So then you become even worse at it. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And culturally, it's then it's a disaster.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thought, because I think the underlying thesis of this research is that emotion and affect and feelings can actually be standardized and can actually be compared amongst humans. And I read your talk very much as a defense of messiness of emotion. And so this is a deep conflict. And I think that's what I was trying to ask before, that if we stay at this shallow understanding of emotions and affect, that it brings us into a technology that confronts us with this very standardized idea of emotion and affect, and that seems very frightening to me. Yeah. So now I think there is more questions here.
I would like to go back to the idea of effective infrastructures and to social media. As you may know, there's a huge debate going on, especially in the English-speaking world, about right now about Facebook and how evil it is and how it's designed. Like scholars like Zeynep Tufekci or Tristan Harris, who say that Facebook is kind of designed to hook you up and to engage, drive your engagement, drive your emotions, drive your affects actually. So I wonder how you would put that in your theory. Would it be like that? Facebook is obviously for you. It's not an effective infrastructure itself, maybe, but is it kind of a infrastructure that abuses effective infrastructure, or how would you put it? Where would you put it?
I don't know. I have to think about this a moment. Like, I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on this. Like, I mean, I guess Facebook it's definitely infrastructure, and of the material kind, the kind which needs to be regulated, that kind, and which breaks down. But this is also like, actually when you were talking, I was thinking about when you have two words or concepts sort of moving together, moving towards each other, and you want there to be a happy interlocking, but there isn't. I don't know. I don't think, again, I don't know if affective infrastructure is like one thing like that. And it's more those movements or moments that that itself is part of, and it is generating, and it is doing. I'm not sure how to actually think about Facebook as affective infrastructure. I think my thoughts about Facebook are, it is, I think maybe much more in terms of media and mediation. It's like a kind of platform which does that, or space which does that. Like, even all of these words are a bit fraught now. Sorry, does anyone else want to? I don't know. My Winona Ryder moment again. I don't know.
I mean, to that, I just add that probably Facebook shouldn't be called an effective infrastructure. As you said, affect is very important on Facebook and for the way we interact with Facebook and on Facebook. But the idea of effective infrastructure just is kind of orthogonal to that, to the idea of Facebook as an actual infrastructure.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think you said it well. Yeah, I like orthogonal.
Maybe you can add a thesis. I was thinking about this. I'm not sure about it, but would you say that it's true that a lot of the infrastructures in social media are more talking to our affects than they're actually reaching our emotions? So our interactions, they're sometimes very impulsive and sometimes very raw, because we're more on the level of untranslated effects that are not really part of a bigger interaction, but really only half transmitted, and so we're stuck with our first effects and don't get to a level of more deeper emotions and actually verbalizing our effects?
No, I mean, I think this is sort of like maybe a continuation of this question about about what social media does, but I think it goes maybe sorry, I feel like I want to reframe your question, or kind of think your question back at you, if that's one way of saying it. I think that I think what's interesting about affect and social media is less in the infrastructural part of it, literally as as a platform it's extremely material and highly infrastructural in the sense of like, roads and the water network or electricity grids. I think it's more interesting how it gets into those places that are affective, that sometimes challenge language, even though it is so much about language. How, if you look at things like influence, if you look at the strength of connections that are made on it, or even the fact that how physical it is. There's this artist called Eric, I'm going to mess up his last name, I'm really sorry, it begins with a P. But he has a series of photographs where he's photographed people in different situations, physical, everyday situations, as if they were holding their phones, but the phone is taken out of their hands. Okay, so you have like this, my favorite one, and I think the most iconic one in that series is of a couple that's in bed, and they have their backs to each other, so they're facing the walls, and they both have their phones, except there's no phone, so they're just looking at their hands. And everybody's been in this situation, and there are other things where, so bodies become different, in a way, and we orient ourselves differently. I mean, we all know about the people walking on the street looking at their phones, but actually what you're doing in that moment is, you may be looking for directions, but you're also engaged in all kinds of emotional, affective worlds and relationships in that moment. So I think that is kind of more interesting in the way we then relate to each other, the way that boundaries form and how you can approach someone or not approach someone, the way you make space for someone else in public transport. Or I can read somebody's behavior, I just know that they're trying to get signal. They're not looking pissed off for any other reason except that they don't have a network connection or they don't have data or, these things. Or the way you form relationships with people when you are traveling and you don't have data. So I think maybe those things for me are the starting point of those connections we form through social media. Otherwise, we make it all about these 5 or 8 companies that own these platforms that, it's like, oh, they're giving us the space to have these affects. I'm like, no, actually, I think there's something else going on that we are making,
Hi, sorry I missed the beginning of your talk, but I'm really glad that I came in anyway because there's so much interesting conversation. And one of the things that your last comment triggered in me was the idea, maybe we replace the word infrastructure with what we've been talking about previously with Facebook being not just being social infrastructure, but also the social graph. And if you think about the affective graph, which is taking, maybe reading it through AI or through some other mechanism and reading the emotion or reading what we're trying to present to the world and anchoring it somewhere so that it can be shared or that it can be collected and so that it can be transmitted. So maybe if we think about affective infrastructure, not necessarily as like, how are we carrying it in tubes to somewhere else, but how are we making that legible in a way that was not previously possible. So if you had an affective graph here, you could say, I said something really stupid, and then suddenly the affective graph in the room is like, oh gosh, that guy is like really confusing or stupid or dumb, or maybe he says something really smart, and then the affective graph changes, and that also has influence on, if you kind of want to tie it back to the concrete world example of Me Too, is like, who are the people who are able to express emotion in a certain way that is then transmitted to other folks and changes the way they act or that changes the way they feel as well.
Thank you for your comment and your words. Somebody was saying something quite interesting to me in an interview I was doing for my Citizen Lab project, where she said, we know so much about how people behave on platforms. We know about this whole sort of behavioral economics of nudges and UX and design that's kind of shaping and forcing people to do certain things and to click and to respond. We don't ever use that in any other way. So when people are tweeting, it's the simplest thing. It's like, Gmail has this feature about, are you sure you want to send this email or whatever it is? So this kind of thing. It's like the simplest things can actually start changing and regulating our behavior. Sometimes maybe not in the most positive way, and sometimes it can be annoying, but yeah, maybe sometimes if these systems were able to give us more information about ourselves to actually just do that emotional thing of actually, like let's say counting to 10 or holding on and breathing deeply. This is how we train ourselves anyway. Or biofeedback, and this was very big in the 70s. The quantified self. I'm not a fan of the quantified self, but I'm just saying that these ways of understanding by naming it something different, by giving it a different visual representation or a place, maybe does some of that work that we need to do because we haven't been doing. We actually don't know how to do, so I hope I responded to that in a way that you intended. Oh, yeah, it was a dialogue. Thanks.
I can't help but to me it's a bit of the elephant of the room when it comes to the affective possibilities of Facebook, because I don't think that you can extricate a platform like that from the political economy. And so ultimately, I mean, what is consumer capitalism but a series of affective draws towards the consumption and production of various capacities? And if that's the situation, you're really just amplifying those through different platforms. So it's an interesting thing. We can look at the discrete object that is Facebook, but you can't extricate that from this larger system. And I think that that's what something like this affective infrastructure idea is really, really great at kind of working through as something like that. I don't know.
No, that's nice. The way you put that is nice. Also, I think when you think of kind of where Facebook what it started out as the Facebook, and it started out as like basically social capital. It's a system for rating if somebody was hot or not. It was like, what gets more affective, and in a college situation, there is nothing more sort of, raw and emotional about that, anything as that, and that should become this is, no, yeah, you said it really well. Thank you. I think that answered actually a lot of these questions as well.
Is there another question in the room?
I'm working on one, but I'm not there yet.
You wanna? Okay, I think that's a good. That's the next keyword. Okay, so thank you very much, Maya, for this lovely conversation. I think we learned a lot and go out with a lot of things that maybe sparked some new mental concepts, and we can extend those over beer now. And Maya will be here a little bit longer with us. And yeah, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for being such a great crowd to talk to and to think with. Yeah, have a wonderful evening, and hopefully you stay a little bit.
Thank you so much.
Sticker?
I have some.